All right, welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're going to really delve into some really fascinating areas of health and wellness.
Yeah. And specifically, like actionable things that
Yeah.
you can incorporate into your life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we've gone through this awesome conversation with Dr. Rhonda Patrick.
Yeah.
Just a treasure trove of
A
information.
lot of great stuff in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so let's jump into it. Let's start with the omega threes.
Yes.
Those essential fatty acids we hear so much about.
Right.
What's the core of why they matter?
Yeah. So omega-3 fatty acids are these essential fats that we need
Okay. Okay.
that we actually can't make in our body.
Right. We got to get it from food.
We got to get them from food.
Okay.
And they're important for a whole variety of functions in the body.
Mm.
And so one of the interesting things is like, how do we actually measure?
Right. Because you go to your blood test, you see a number, but is that the whole picture?
Right. And there's actually a better way to measure omega-3 status than just the standard sort of blood test you might get.
Mhm.
And that's called the omega-3 index.
Interesting.
And this was developed by a guy named Dr. Bill Harris
Okay.
at the Fatty Acid Research Institute. And basically what the omega-3 index is it's a measurement of the amount of EPA and DHA,
Right.
which are the two main omega-3s that we care about in the membranes of our red blood cells.
Okay. In the cell membrane, not just floating around in your blood.
Exactly. So it's not just in your plasma.
Got it.
It's actually incorporated into the cells. And that's important because red blood cells have a lifespan of 120 days.
Okay.
So it gives you a longer term view of what your omega-3 status is.
Gotcha.
Whereas if you just take it in your plasma, it can change like after a meal.
I see.
It
So,
does.
so the omega-3 index, and that's the more accurate picture.
Yeah.
Okay. What does that actually tell us about, our health and how it's affected?
Yeah. So what's really fascinating is there have been studies that have looked at the omega-3 index and have actually looked at all-cause mortality.
Wow. Okay.
So basically, like your risk of dying from any cause other than an accident.
Okay. All right. So like big picture stuff.
Big picture stuff.
Okay.
And so what they do is they'll compare people who have a low omega-3 index, let's say 4% or less,
Okay.
to people who have a high omega-3 index, which would be 8% or higher.
Okay. And what are they finding when they compare those two groups?
Well, what's really interesting is the people who have a higher omega-3 index
Yeah.
actually have a 5-year increased life expectancy
Oh.
compared to people who have a low omega-3 index.
Okay. That's a significant 5-year difference.
It is. And just to give you a perspective, the average omega-3 index in the United States is like 4 to 5%.
Okay.
Whereas if you look at a country like Japan,
Mhm.
where they eat a lot of seafood, their average omega-3 index is closer to 10%.
Right. And they also have a pretty high life expectancy.
Right.
Um, and you mentioned a surprising connection with smoking as well.
Yeah, this was one of the things that I thought was really, really fascinating.
Yeah. How does that play into it?
So they looked at different factors, and smoking was one of them. And what they found was that smokers who had a high omega-3 index had the same life expectancy as non-smokers who had a low omega-3 index.
Oh, wow. So it's like saying that if you have a low omega-3 index, that could be as detrimental to your lifespan as continuing to smoke.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's a pretty striking comparison.
It is.
And I think Dr. Patrick made a really good point when she was talking about this, which is that
Yeah.
we often think about health in terms of like, what do we need to avoid?
Right.
Like don't
Don't
smoke,
eat this, don't do that.
don't eat trans fats,
Yeah.
don't do all these things. But she said, it's not just about what you avoid, it's also about what you get.
Right.
And omega-3 fatty acids are something that we need to get.
They're essential.
They're essential for our body to function properly.
So we can't just focus on what we're cutting out. We need to also think about what we're actively putting into our bodies to support our health. Now, when we see a correlation like that, lower omega-3 index, lower life expectancy, is that a direct cause and effect relationship? Or is it possible that there are other lifestyle factors that are influencing those outcomes as well?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think whenever we're looking at these sort of epidemiological studies,
Yeah.
Observational studies, we can't really say for sure that one thing causes the other.
Right.
We can just say that they're correlated.
Right.
And so it's possible that there's something called a healthy user bias,
Okay.
which basically means that people who take omega-3s
Yeah.
might also be doing other things that are good for their health.
Right. They might be exercising more. They might be eating better overall.
Right. They might be sleeping better.
Yeah.
So it's hard to
All right.
tease apart all the factors. But
For sure.
they did try to account for some of those things in this analysis.
Okay.
They looked at things like physical activity levels, body mass index, and, they still found this correlation.
So it's not definitive proof,
Yeah.
but it's a pretty strong suggestion that those omega-3s are playing a beneficial role.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. And what about specific diseases we always hear about omega-3s and heart health?
Right.
What's the connection there?
Yeah, so omega-3 fatty acids are really, really important for cardiovascular health.
Okay.
And this is one area where we actually do have randomized controlled trials.
Okay, so this is like the gold standard of evidence.
Yeah, where they actually give people EPA and DHA or a placebo, and they see what happens.
Yeah.
And what they find is that people who supplement with EPA and DHA have a significantly lower risk of heart attack.
Okay.
And also death from cardiovascular disease.
So this is huge, right? Because cardiovascular disease is still the leading cause of death.
It's a big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
And what is it about the omega-3s that is so protective for our hearts? What's the mechanism of action?
Yeah, so one of the main mechanisms is that omega-3 fatty acids are anti-inflammatory.
Okay.
And chronic inflammation is a major driver of heart disease.
I see.
And so by reducing inflammation,
Yeah.
they can help protect against those negative effects.
So they're kind of like a systemic, benefit that had these downstream impacts on specific disease processes.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Okay, so for you, the learner listening, what are some practical steps that you can take to make sure you're getting enough of these omega-3s?
Yeah, so the goal is to get your omega-3 index up to that 8% or higher.
Okay.
And if you have a low omega-3 index, which many people in the United States do around that 4% range.
Yeah.
Research has shown that taking about 2 grams of omega-3s per day in supplement form
Okay.
can get your levels up to that 8%.
So 2 grams, that's like a doable amount.
It's doable, yeah. And to give you a perspective, prescription strength omega-3s are usually like 4 grams per day.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So
2 grams is a good starting point.
yeah.
Now, there are so many different omega-3 supplements on the market. How do we know which ones are good quality?
Yeah, this is a really important point because omega-3s can go rancid.
Oh.
They can oxidize, and then they're not beneficial anymore. In fact,
Okay.
they could be harmful.
Gotcha.
So what you want to look for are supplements that have been third-party tested
Okay.
for their EPA and DHA content, their purity, so they're not contaminated with heavy metals.
Like mercury and things like that.
Yeah, exactly, like PCBs, mercury, things like that.
Yeah.
And you want to see what the oxidation level is.
Okay.
Ideally, it should be below 10%.
All right. So we're looking at the purity. We're looking at the oxidation level.
Right.
What about these different forms of omega-3s that we see, like ethyl ester versus triglyceride? What's the difference?
Yeah, so ethyl ester and triglyceride are 2 main forms of omega-3s that you'll see in supplements. Ethyl ester is the form that's typically used in prescription omega-3s.
Okay.
It's a little bit more concentrated,
Okay.
but it's generally less bioavailable.
Less bioavailable, meaning we don't absorb it as well.
Your body doesn't absorb it as well. The triglyceride form is the form that's found naturally in fish,
Okay.
and that's statistically better absorbed.
Gotcha.
So if you're taking an ethyl ester supplement, it's important to take it with a meal
Okay.
that has some fat in it
To help with absorption?
to help with absorption. Yeah.
Okay.
The triglyceride form, you don't really need to worry about that as much.
Okay, so if we're choosing a supplement, we want to go for that triglyceride form generally.
Yeah, I would say so,
Okay.
generally speaking.
All right, what about getting omega-3s from food? How much fish do we need to eat?
Yeah, so this is a question that I get a lot, and it's a little bit tricky to answer.
Yeah, because you hear all these different recommendations.
Yeah, there's no hard and fast rule.
Right.
But, one thing that we know is that wild-caught Alaskan salmon is a really good source of omega-3s, and it tends to be lower in contaminants
Okay.
than some other types of fish.
Yeah.
But the exact amount that you would need to eat per week to get your omega-3 index up to 8% is unclear. It really depends on a lot of factors.
Right, depends on the individual.
Yeah.
Depends on, how much you're already getting, how it's prepared,
All
these
these-
things.
And Dr. Patrick's assessment is that for most people, supplementation is probably necessary
Okay.
to really get to that 8%.
So it's good to have a combination of incorporating those foods and supplementing.
Exactly. I think that's a really good strategy.
Okay.
So yeah, 2 grams per day of a high quality, low oxidation triglyceride omega-3 supplement.
Okay.
Plus, some fatty fish in your diet a couple times a week.
A good balance.
I think that's a good approach.
That makes sense.
Uh,
So we've covered the omega-3s.
Yeah.
Let's move on to another area of interest, time-restricted feeding.
Oh, okay.
This has become a really popular topic.
Yeah, very trendy.
Yeah. But what's the science behind it?
Yeah, so time-restricted feeding or time-restricted eating is basically a pattern of eating where you consume all of your meals and snacks within a certain window of time each day. Okay. And then you fast for the remaining hours.
Okay.
And so the idea behind this is that it's based on our circadian rhythm.
Okay.
So our bodies have these natural 24-hour cycles.
Yep.
And it seems that our metabolism is actually optimized to eat during certain times of the day
Yeah.
and then to fast during other times of the day.
So it's not just what we're eating, but it's also when we're eating that affects our health.
Right.
Let me-
And, one of the things that we know is that we're most sensitive to insulin in the morning,
Okay.
and we become less sensitive to insulin as the day goes on.
Okay.
And so
So that's part of the thought behind this is, we want to eat when we're more insulin sensitive.
yeah.
Okay.
And we want to avoid eating when we're less insulin sensitive.
Now, one of the things that I think got lost in translation with time-restricted feeding is that a lot of people just thought, oh, it means skipping breakfast.
Right.
I'm just going to eat from noon to 8 or something like that.
Yeah, it became very simplified to just skip breakfast.
But what are some of the potential downsides of that?
Yeah, so one of the things that we need to think about when it comes to time-restricted feeding is muscle health.
Okay, muscle health. Yeah, that's important.
Yeah. And the reason for that is that our muscles are actually a major storage depot for amino acids.
Okay.
And so when we eat protein,
Yeah.
those amino acids go into our muscles.
Okay.
And they're used to build and repair muscle tissue.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we fast overnight,
Yeah.
we're actually breaking down muscle protein
Okay.
to provide our body with those amino acids.
So it's kind of like we're cannibalizing our muscles in a way.
Yeah.
When we're fasting.
And so it's important to break that fast
Okay.
with a meal that contains protein.
I see.
So if you're skipping breakfast,
Yeah.
you're essentially prolonging that period of muscle protein breakdown.
So that could potentially have negative consequences for our muscle mass.
Right. And muscle mass is really important for a lot of reasons. It helps us maintain our metabolism. It helps us stay strong as we age.
Yeah.
It helps us prevent falls.
All right.
So it's really important to maintain that muscle mass.
And so, if we're consistently skipping breakfast,
Yeah.
that could, be detrimental to that.
Right.
What about if somebody's doing resistance training? Does that change things?
Yeah. So if you're doing resistance training, you can actually maintain muscle mass, even if you're doing time-restricted feeding.
Okay.
And the reason for that is that resistance training is a very potent stimulator of muscle protein synthesis.
Okay.
So it actually helps to counteract
I see.
that muscle protein breakdown that happens during fasting.
So we're sending the signal to build muscle even though we're in a fasted state.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's actually been research that has shown this specifically in women
Okay.
who practice time-restricted feeding.
Yeah.
They found that the women who were doing resistance training were able to maintain their muscle mass.
Okay, so that's good news.
Yeah.
So if you're working out, you can still do time-restricted feeding and maintain that muscle.
Right.
Now, what about if you're trying to build muscle?
Mm-hmm.
Does skipping breakfast limit your gains?
So it doesn't necessarily limit your gains as long as you're getting enough protein
Okay.
throughout the day.
Throughout the day. So it's
Yeah.
not just about when you're eating it, but it's about the total protein intake.
Exactly. And, the RDA for protein, which is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight,
Yeah, we've all heard that number.
is probably too low,
Okay.
especially if you're active.
Interesting.
And so the current recommendations are more like 1.2 grams per kilogram
Okay.
to prevent muscle loss,
All right.
and then 1.6 grams per kilogram
Okay.
if you're trying to build muscle.
All right. So those are higher numbers than we've typically been told.
Yeah, and for older adults,
Yeah.
it's probably even higher because they have something called anabolic resistance,
Okay.
which means that their muscles are less responsive to the signals that tell them to build protein.
So they need even more of that protein stimulus to get the same
Yeah,
effect.
Yeah.
Okay. So if we're going to do time-restricted feeding in a way that is beneficial for our overall health,
Yeah.
We want to make sure we're getting enough protein, we're allowing time for repair. How can we practically do that?
Yeah, so I think the key is to make sure that you're eating a high protein meal
Yeah.
relatively early in the day.
Okay.
So, you want to break your fast
Ooh.
with some protein.
So don't be afraid to have that breakfast.
Right.
Some protein in it.
Exactly. And then, you still want to allow for a rest and digest period.
Okay.
So, don't eat too close to bedtime.
Right.
Um,
Okay.
I think a good rule of thumb is 2 to 3 hours before bed.
Okay.
Try to stop eating.
So we're getting the benefit of that early protein intake, but we're also giving ourselves that fasting window.
Exactly.
Okay. That makes sense.
And that way you can kind of get the best of both worlds.
All right. Um, and it's also important to remember that, some of the weight loss that people see with time-restricted feeding
Yeah.
is simply because they're eating fewer calories.
Right.
If you restrict your eating window,
Yeah.
you're naturally going to eat less.
And that's one of the mechanisms by which time-restricted feeding can be beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
It can help people reduce their calorie intake without even really trying.
Right. It's just natural. You're not as hungry. You're not eating for as many hours.
Right, yeah.
But it's important to make sure that you're still getting those essential nutrients.
Yes, definitely.
Even if you're restricting your eating window.
Right. And if you restrict your calories too much
Yeah.
without doing resistance training,
Mm-hmm.
you can actually lose muscle mass.
Even if you're overweight or obese.
Right.
Yeah.
So, it's really about finding that balance
Mhm.
between, restricting calories enough to lose weight,
Mm-hmm.
but not so much that you're losing muscle.
Right. It's all about finding what works best for you as an individual.
Exactly.
All right. So let's move on to a more general approach to nutrition, beyond just when we're eating.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the overall quality of our diet.
Okay.
What are some of the key things that we should be focusing on?
Yeah. So, we talked about omega-3 fatty acids.
Yeah.
And those are an essential nutrient.
Okay.
But there are lots of other essential nutrients that our bodies need.
Right. It's not just about calories in, calories out.
Yeah.
We need to think about the quality of those calories.
Exactly. And, there's a really interesting researcher named Dr. Bruce Ames
Okay.
who's done a lot of work on micronutrients.
Okay.
And so micronutrients are things like vitamins and minerals
Great.
and amino acids and fatty acids.
Okay. So they're these smaller components of our food.
Right. They're the things that our bodies use
Yeah.
to do all of the important functions,
Mhm.
like, repairing DNA,
Yeah.
producing energy,
Hmm.
synthesizing neurotransmitters,
All the essential stuff.
all the important stuff. And, if we're deficient in these micronutrients,
Mhm.
it can actually lead to a lot of problems down the road.
So we may not see the effects right away, but they can build up over time.
Right. And this is why it's really important to make sure that we're getting enough of these micronutrients in our diet.
Okay, so it's not just about avoiding bad stuff. It's about actively trying to get the good stuff.
Exactly.
So what are some of the best food sources for these essential micronutrients?
Yeah. So, one of the things that Dr. Patrick talked about is leafy green vegetables.
Okay.
And, I think sometimes people hear that and they're like, oh, leafy green vegetables.
Right, it's not the most exciting food group.
But they're actually really important.
Okay.
Because they're packed with micronutrients. So things like magnesium, calcium, vitamin K, folate. And, Dr. Patrick actually mentioned a study
Okay.
where they found that folate deficiency
Okay.
caused the same amount of DNA damage
Yeah.
as ionizing radiation.
Okay, that's pretty significant.
Yeah, so these micronutrients are really important.
Yeah, they're protecting our DNA. They're helping our cells function properly.
Exactly.
Okay.
Well,
Leafy greens are in.
leafy greens are in.
Right, what else?
Another really good source of micronutrients is meat.
Okay.
So things like beef, lamb, pork, poultry.
Mm-hmm.
These are all good sources of iron, protein, B vitamins, zinc.
Okay.
And, there's been some controversy around meat lately.
Sure.
But, I think it's important to remember that it can be a very nutrient-dense food.
And we're talking about getting those essential nutrients from wherever we can.
Right.
And so if meat is part of your diet,
Mm-hmm.
that's a good source for that.
Yeah. And, if you're concerned about the quality of the meat, you can always choose grass-fed
Yeah.
or organic options.
And what about the difference between grass-fed and conventional? Are there significant health differences there?
Yeah, so there are some differences in the nutrient content of grass-fed versus conventional meat. Grass-fed meat tends to have a better omega-3 to omega-6 ratio.
That's good.
And there's also some concern about things like glyphosate
Yeah.
and hormones and antibiotics that are used in conventional meat production.
Mm-hmm.
But, I think it's important to also keep in mind the cost.
Right.
Grass-fed meat is often more expensive.
Sure.
And so it's not accessible to everyone.
Yeah.
And, I think our bodies are pretty resilient.
Yeah.
And so as long as we're getting those essential nutrients,
Yeah.
I think we can be healthy.
Whether it's grass-fed or conventional.
Right.
Okay, so leafy greens, meat, what else?
I think in general, a diet that's rich in unprocessed foods
Okay.
is going to be beneficial.
So fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds,
Exactly.
whole grains.
Yeah.
Unprocessed, as close to nature as possible.
Right.
Okay.
And, Dr. Patrick talked about the paleo diet as an example of a diet that's high in micronutrients and also phytochemicals, which are these plant compounds that have a lot of health benefits.
So it's not just about, those essential nutrients. It's also about these other compounds that we're getting from these whole foods.
Right. And, one of the things that's important to remember is that calories still matter.
Of course.
So
Right.
you don't want to just eat a ton of food and think that it's healthy.
Sure. We need to be mindful of that energy balance.
Right. We still need to pay attention to calories in versus calories out.
Absolutely. Okay. So we've got a good foundation there for our nutrition.
Yeah.
We're getting those micronutrients. We're eating those whole unprocessed foods. We're paying attention to our calorie intake.
Right.
Let's talk about cognitive function.
Okay.
How can we improve our focus, our productivity, even our mood
Right.
through our daily habits?
Yeah. So when it comes to cognitive function, I like to think about it in terms of like big movers
Okay.
and lower hanging.
All right. I like that analogy. So the big movers,
Yeah.
these are the things that really make a big difference.
Yeah. The things that require a little bit more effort,
Okay.
but, they can have a big impact.
Yeah.
And then the lower hanging fruit are the things that are easier to do,
Okay.
but, they might not have as big of an impact.
All right. So give me some examples of these big movers for cognitive function.
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest movers is exercise.
Exercise. Okay. We hear this all the time, but why is it so important for our brains?
Yeah. So exercise has been shown to improve cognitive function in people of all ages.
Really?
Yeah. So it's not just for older adults.
Wow. Okay.
It's for everyone.
So even if you're young and you think your brain's working fine, exercise can still help.
It can still help. Yeah.
Okay. What are some of the specific benefits that we see?
So it improves things like memory,
Okay.
executive function, which is like planning and decision making, processing speed.
Okay.
And it even helps to increase the volume of certain areas of the brain.
Wow. So it's actually changing the structure of our brains.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing.
Okay. Now, are we talking about, hours of endurance training to see those benefits, or can we get away with less?
You can definitely get away with less.
Okay.
Even short bouts of exercise can be beneficial.
Okay. That's good to know.
Yeah, and high-intensity interval training is a really good way to get a lot of bang for your buck.
Okay. So we're talking about, short bursts of really intense activity.
Yeah.
Oh.
And another thing that's been shown to be beneficial for cognitive function is multivitamins.
Multivitamins. Okay. This is interesting because I feel like the research on this has been a little bit mixed in the past.
Yeah, it has been mixed in the past.
Yeah.
But there was a recent study that came out called the Cosmo trial.
Okay.
And they found that in older adults,
Yeah.
so people over the age of 65,
Okay.
taking a daily multivitamin actually improved their cognitive performance.
Wow.
And it also seemed to slow down the rate of brain aging.
So this is like a pretty significant finding.
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
And, it's possible that even younger people could benefit from taking a multivitamin.
I see. So even if you're not, in that older age group, it might still be a good idea to consider.
Yeah, I think of it as like an insurance policy,
Okay.
just to make sure that you're getting all of the nutrients that you need.
To support that brain health.
Right.
Okay. So exercise, multivitamins. What else are we missing in
Wait.
terms of those big movers for cognitive function?
Sleep.
Sleep, of course.
You can't forget about sleep.
You got to get enough sleep.
Right.
Okay. So those are the big movers. What about the lower hanging fruit? What are some easier things that we can do?
Yeah, so some easier things that you can do to support cognitive function or,
Yeah.
making sure you're getting enough omega-3 fatty acids.
Okay. So that ties back to what we were talking about earlier.
Right. Another thing is to limit refined carbohydrates.
Okay. Refined carbs. Why are those bad for our brains?
So refined carbohydrates can cause spikes and crashes in blood sugar. Okay. And that can lead to cognitive fog
Right.
and, just not feeling your best mentally.
Yeah. So you get that sugar rush and then you crash.
Right.
And you're not thinking as clearly.
Yeah. Okay.
And then another thing that you can do is incorporate something called exercise snacks.
Exercise snacks. What's that?
So exercise snacks are basically just like short bursts of activity that
Okay.
you can do throughout the day.
Okay.
And, they've been shown to improve blood sugar control
Okay.
and also cognitive function.
But even if it's not.